from Chicago. This is Big Ten Today, presented by Rally House. Mike Hall and Anthony Herron here with you. Not quite a 17-1 performance that we saw in Week 1.
No, not exactly.
But overall, pretty good week again for the Big Ten.
I would agree. Yes, some big games won, some disappointing defeats as well. One conference class that I got to call also, which was a lot of fun. And it's basically capped off by that opening line. I mean, Bielema feeling bubbly and champagne. Rare work from you. I was really impressed.
See, you could have just left it as a compliment, but then you said rare work and made sure to really dig into that's what friends are for. Speaking of friends, Ross Dellinger from Yahoo Sports is with us. He's someone who's just nice the whole time, really doesn't code anything in anger or meanness. What was your biggest takeaway from this week, Ross?
Well, that was a great opening line. I thought delivered perfectly. Really, really solid. My biggest takeaway was, probably the Huskers, right? Just rolled over Colorado. I know they struggled a little bit in the second half, but played great defense. Raiola looked really good against competition that, at the Power 5 level. So that was the one that stood out to me. It's not like Nebraska had high expectations already, right? But now they're even higher.
We're going to talk about those changing expectations in the course of this show. It is a busy show, as I mentioned. There's a couple of big names that are joining us, too. Urban Meyer and Jerry DiNardo are going to talk about the edge that kept Oregon undefeated. Bret Bielema will join us to talk about that 2-0 start. And Indiana's off to L.A. for the first time since the early 1980s. That's all coming up, but we're going to start things off with our big story, and that is this week's big game in the conference. The Wisconsin Badgers are welcoming in top 5 ranked Alabama. Badgers are undefeated, 2-0 start to the year. However, neither win was really crazy impressive. They will also be without Jake Chaney for the first half of this game due to a targeting penalty from last week. Here's the latest from head coach Luke Fickell.
Us as coaches like to try to say, hey, it was a routine. We do everything the same way, no matter what it is, the faceless, nameless opponent. The realities of those things is probably not true. Some of us can hide our heads and live under a rock like I do, but our guys understand. Our guys are much more aware. And so this was something that had been talked about since spring football, and not by me. I'm not like standing up there and say, hey, this is Alabama week in spring ball, and we're going to do this. And we work on the rivalry weeks. We talk about, the teams that we play historically. We don't talk about some of these games, but our guys are all aware of it. And so for them, it's been something that, just like me, it's been in the back of their heads, probably a little bit closer to the front of their heads too often. But it's something where I think they really do understand. Like, this is what makes college football, right? There's two things. College football is great, but rivalries and games like this is what really kind of separates college football from everything else.
Here's a look at the big board, and you see on the left there, Alabama, Wisconsin, the big noon Eastern game on Fox. We're going to have more on Alabama and the Badgers later in the show. For now, we're going to turn to some of the other storylines in the league as we transition from Week 2 to Week 3. You mentioned this right off the bat, Ross. Nebraska is a big-time story at this point. 2 dominant wins, 2 good performances from the freshman QB, Dylan Raiola. Are we officially at the point where we need to adjust the expectations for what this season will be in Lincoln?
Well, I think coming into the season, there were pretty high expectations. You had Matt Rule in year 2. If you look at his track record, that's when he's really started to take a program to the next level. In the second year, you had Dylan Raiola, obviously true freshman. The buzz coming out of camp was big. So the expectation was pretty high. And I think a lot of folks, Nebraska was their kind of sleeper pick, right, to potentially challenge in the league and challenge for maybe even getting to that 9-10 win mark and challenging for the playoff. And now I just think the expectations are even more heightened, right? Especially when you look at not just Raiola, right? The offense has been great, but look at what the defense has done in 2 games. 8 sacks, I think tied for the second most in the conference. They pressured quarterbacks on basically 1/3 of dropbacks, according to the Pro Football Focus numbers. That's pretty incredible. Are the black shirts back? It sure feels like it. 2 touchdowns in 2 games.
And I wouldn't say Matt Rule went full like Kurt Cignetti since the game, but there's an additional kind of bravado that I think he carries into the now Nebraska being 2-0 for the first time in nearly a decade, beating Colorado for the first time in well over a decade. There's at least some accomplishment at this point that now Matt Rule can say, here's tangible evidence, here's some proof of concept for what I've done at multiple other stops before now. That being said, I completely agree with Ross's point that there were a lot of outside folks who did have big expectations for this team, but it's not a foreign situation to this program, though. I mean, the previous regime under Scott Frost had several seasons they went in with big expectations because the previous year would feel like, oh, there's these near misses, or, well, if it wasn't for that special teams gaffe, or whoops, we turned it over late and we lost a key game. That was the story of Matt Rule's first season, but he went through the offseason. He and his team have done the work. And now through 2 games, it does look like this is a different Nebraska squad. So my expectations, we're taking a bit of a wait-and-see approach through 2 games. Thoroughly impressed with what we've seen from the Huskers so far, but can they sustain it? That's still a question I have, Mike.
Right. We're only 2 games in, but here's one stat that I think helps the turnaround. 31 lost turnovers last year.
Right.
Worst in the country. 1 through 8 quarters this season.
Huge.
It's a huge, big difference. You can't stay in games if you're turning the ball over, and through a small sample size, they've been great. To the point that their little graphic, Ross, has a 23 next to it. They're ranked for the first time in 5 years.
Yeah, incredible. You mentioned that turnover rate. I think their total turnover margin last year was like something absurd. It was one of the worst in the nation. I don't think when it was like minus 17 or minus 15. So you knew that had to improve. And so far, so good, securing the ball. And hey, look at that schedule, guys. They will be favored in every game until Ohio State. So could you imagine a 7-0 Nebraska playing at the Buckeyes in Columbus?
There's been a bunch of folks who've been imagining that for a little while, and now you get through the Colorado game, the rivalry game that, frankly, they out-physicaled Colorado last season, too. But there were those turnovers. There was the offensive inefficiency. And now with this true freshman QB and Dylan Raiola, that's the thing that stands out to me about him as much as anything. Yes, there are some pretty passes. There's some impressive nuance to the way he throws the football, but there's a composure to the way he carries himself on the field. There is this confidence, and he doesn't try to get outside himself too much. He's played with such efficiency in protecting the football so far that you wouldn't necessarily anticipate a freshman stepping into his first college football atmosphere would be able to protect the football at a higher level than veterans who'd been behind center for the Huskers over the last handful of years. But that's who he's been, and there were so many expectations. He's handled them as well as he could.
As a fan of college football, it is so fun to see that fan base.
Yeah.
The 80,000 just going nuts and having a reason to go nuts. And the fact that they could have that throughout October, maybe getting to 7-0 at some point, it's just really fun if you're a fan of the sport. Now, speaking of big crowds, Illinois had a sellout in this game. First time they've had that in 8 years as they took down a top 20 ranked Kansas team. They're now 2-0. Ross, the expectations weren't really sky high for Illinois coming into the year. What are they at this point?
Yeah, and speaking of Nebraska, right? I think they play at Illinois on a Friday night in a couple weeks, so that's an interesting one. Yeah, you're right. The expectations for the Illini weren't very high entering the season. I don't know if they've altogether changed. You look at the last game against Kansas. Look, this isn't your dad or your grandpa's Kansas, right? This Kansas is really good, and Lance Leopold has had this program the last couple years as one of the best in the Big 12. A lot of folks picked Kansas to win the Big 12 this year, and in Illinois put them away, and specifically defensively. It's not often you see a team win a game not cracking the 300-yard mark offensively. But Illinois found a way to do it and did it well on defense. 3 interceptions, a fumble recovery, returned one of those interceptions for a touchdown. So big win. First non-conference home win since 2011. That seems hard to believe, but big stuff for Bret Bielema, and that's a power conference, a non-conference home win. And big stuff for Bret Bielema. And you look at, again, the upcoming schedule in a couple weeks, they get the Huskers.
Are you predicting maybe they'll both be ranked by the time you get to that game? I mean, who would have predicted that would potentially be the case by the time the Illini face the Huskers in late September? But that's on the table for the way each program has been performing up to this point, Ross. And you talk about the defense. I couldn't agree more, especially a guy like Xavier Scott, Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week, all the tackles he had, multiple interceptions, forced fumble, pick six being one of those. I mean, he went out there making plays that now reminds us of the defense that Ryan Walters put on the field 2 seasons ago with all those exceptional secondary players, the plays that were being made on the back end, and the way that he wasn't the only Scott that was out there getting big things done either. Miles Scott was able to get big things happening on the back end also. So if you get that type of production, that performance, that confidence against an offense in Kansas that in recent years has been one of the most explosive in college football. So going into the game, I thought, all right, if Illinois is going to win, it's got to be like Caden Fagan controlling the clock, and their offensive line has to dominate the line of scrimmage. That wasn't the case. That Illini defense, though, was lights out throughout the night.
You're right. 2 years ago with Ryan Walters, they were one of the best defenses in the country. They lose him last year, take a huge drop off. This year, 2 games in, giving up a grand total of 17 points.
Right.
That's the key part to their turnaround this year. Let's check in on Michigan State, too. 2-0 right now, Ross. One kind of ugly win to start the year. A much more impressive conference win this past weekend. Where are you with the green and white?
Yeah, as out of sync as Aiden Childs and Michigan State was in the opener against FAU is how in sync they seem to be against Maryland. I mean, there were some hiccups, but you see what they did late in the game. That has to be a good feeling for Jonathan Smith taking over a first-year program and to see how they hung in, right? Because they were down much of the game. They hung in and then late got it done. Childs with over 360 yards of offense, 3 TDs, of course, including that 77-yarder, right, to Nick Marsh, who just exploded onto the scene as a true freshman. I think he was Big Ten's true freshman of the week. Incredible performance. I think he had the most receiving yards, or second most receiving yards for a freshman in school history. Big body, physical, can catch the ball if you just put it anywhere near him. So that has to be huge to see them going on the road. And I don't know which Michigan State is really Michigan State, the one we saw at home struggle against FAU, or the one we saw there in College Park. But Jonathan Smith, I'm sure will take that College Park version every day.
I'm looking forward to watching them try to answer that question. I called the game over the weekend against Maryland. I've got them again actually this week on the Big Ten Network. And the word that kept occurring to me throughout that game in College Park was response. Because the way they looked in that first effort against FAU, there were a lot of questions about Aiden Childs and the excitement that was there for a young quarterback. Questions about whether or not they have a top-flight receiver or two. Montorie Foster didn't play well in the opening game. Nick Marsh only had 1 catch in that first game. Then they lose Alante Brown. So what happens at the receiver position? What can that defense do? Can they respond again against one of the better offenses in the Big Ten? And all those questions were, you know what? Yes, they responded. Aiden Childs threw the ball with confidence. Still imperfect. Those were the perfect imperfections of a young and talented quarterback. So he was still out there slinging it. They came out throwing the football. I like the adjustment that Jonathan Smith and Brian Lindgren made to the game plan. It wasn't all about the deep ball. They trusted the short and intermediate passing game to open things up. It got a little bit of run game going, and then the deep shots started to connect. And especially in a critical moment down the stretch of the game with Nick Marsh out in the open field, he made it happen. So for that whole team to respond in the way that they did under a new regime with a lot of new players and new personalities in that locker room, thoroughly impressed with what they did.
Right. What felt like to many a bit of a rebuilding season is off to a start that at least makes them feel good, especially with young players like Marsh stepping up and making big plays. Got to work on their penalties. 12 penalties in one game, 10 penalties in the next. But for now, they're off to a 2-0 start. Plenty more football to come on the show, but a quick respite to tell you the latest women's volleyball poll is out, and the Big Ten, as you'd expect, is all over it. Penn State, the highest ranked team at number 3 in the country, one of 4 Big Ten teams that are ranked in the top 8. Add in Oregon, Minnesota, and USC, that's 7 teams that are ranked this week. So thank goodness they had those special teams plays this past weekend. It helped them out for sure. Ross, what would you say is the biggest question right now for the Ducks?
Well, certainly it's the offensive line. What do they say often about football teams, if you don't have an O-line, you don't have anything. And I think we've seen the Ducks O-line struggle considerably. They have the explosive offensive players. They have the good skill players. Their defense has played well at times. They're searching for the right group still offensively. They've used 4 different combinations of players along the offensive line. So I think coaches are obviously trying to find the right mix and match. How about this? Through 2 games, Oregon's offensive line has allowed 7 sacks, and that doesn't include many other pressures. So that has to get shored up before this Big Ten schedule cranks up.
They're in at least an advantageous position where they're not dominating the line of scrimmage, but they still have explosive playmakers who can make plays. Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson, you get them in the open field, and there's touchdowns waiting to happen, but they do. If they're going to compete for a Big Ten championship, they have to get better up front. I agree, Ross, on the offensive line, but also the defensive front. You look at the way that the opponents have moved the ball on Oregon, especially in some critical moments through their first couple of games this season. There's signs for concern there, too. Not only the D-line, but at the linebacker position. And the overall operation has just been a little sloppier than I anticipated, than I think a lot of folks anticipated, where the ball has been on the ground a bunch. They've blown protections. There have been penalties on special teams. So there's a lot for Oregon to be 2-0 and be sort of, satisfied with in the moment. But there's a lot of meat on the bone, not only with the execution between the white lines, but just the level of focus that's really required for a championship level team.
It's kind of to summarize the two of you, basically, the line of scrimmage on both sides
for
Oregon has been one of the big problems for them. And by the way, they haven't even played a great team yet. So we're 2 games in.
Now, Boise State may make the college football playoff. I think they're definitely a good, but they've got better waiting on their schedule.
You flip that over to Michigan. They did play a great team.
Right.
Texas was in the playoff last year. They're one of the favorites to be the national champion again this year. But Michigan went down to them, Ross, and at times it didn't even look like they really belonged on the field with them.
No, I don't know that there were many people realistically expecting Michigan to beat Texas. I mean, a bunch of players lost, head coach lost, a bunch of coaches, coordinator lost from last year's national title winning team. And then, as you mentioned, right, they're playing a Texas team that's kind of loaded. I mean, they are built and ready this year to win a national title themselves. But they didn't look good. You're right. They almost didn't look like you said, like they should have been in the same division. It really goes back to the offensive struggles, and the struggles at quarterback and the lack of explosive plays, but really for me, when you look at the line of scrimmage, and we're talking a lot today about the lines of scrimmage, you look at the group of NFL players this Michigan program has up front defensively, and they were just kind of dominated by Texas's offensive line. Now, Texas has one of the best offensive lines in the country, but you expected a little more out of them. But they kind of got manhandled up front, and that I would think is something certainly kind of like we talked about Oregon. It's going to have to improve before this Big Ten schedule gets cranked up.
My guy Harold Shelton, he gave me this stat. He may have sent it to you as well. There were 5 times in that game against Texas where Michigan and their defensive front had to try to hold Texas with less than 2 yards to go, and Texas on the run play was able to move the chains for a first down over and over again. That happened 5 times. Texas converted all 5 of those opportunities. That is a huge deal for Michigan on the line of scrimmage because, yes, they won the last 3 Big Ten championships. They won the last national championship. They had a first-round pick as a QB, and their offensive line was incredible. But this wasn't an offense that consistently overwhelmed their opponents. The Michigan defense was what consistently overwhelmed team after team, week after week. That's where I'd say the biggest disparity between last season's squad and this season's squad has been, and that's what I frankly find surprising because Mason Graham is an amazing football player. Kenneth Grant is one of the better defensive tackles in the conference, and Will Johnson may be the first corner off the board in the next NFL draft. So they've got 3 of the best players on the field on their defense every time they take the field, and that's where right now the Wolverines, to me, have the most ground to cover for the standard that's been set in recent years and the consistency of that dominance for that defense. That's where I think there's the bigger disparity right now.
Yeah, Harold did send me the note. He actually sent it before he sent it to you.
Are you serious?
But I think the other thing is kind of the opposite of what we said with Nebraska is turnovers. They were not a problem for Michigan last year. 8 turnovers all season. They have 4. Half of what they had all of last year they have through just 2 weeks this year. By the way, Anthony, Iowa is such an interesting case. A couple weeks in, They were so dominant week one, and it felt like all the holes were patched. And then week two, it didn't look bad, but they blew it in the end against their rival.
And some of it was in, we're talking about teams who haven't really suited their personalities so far. There are some of those ways where Iowa's execution in the second half, ill-advised throws from Cade McNamara, an experienced QB, leading to a turnover. In the defensive secondary, we're not accustomed to seeing a 2-score lead for that Iowa defense at Kinnick Stadium. It's supposed to be show is over. That's when you're supposed to know Iowa can come out and win this game. They're giving up deep shots, chunk plays in the passing game. That's not what we're accustomed to on either side of the ball. Even on Iowa's offense, for the lack of explosion that's been there, when it comes down to they got a lead in the second half, they've protected the football at a high level. That's not what showed up the other day in the Cy-Hawk game. Some things to correct for Kirk Ferentz and his staff.
Here's another note from researcher Harold Shelton, who again gave it to me before you. They have now scored fewer than 20 points 8 of their last 9 games against FBS competition.
They win most of them, though.
That's actually true.
It's our saving grace.
That's a good point. Quite the start to the season in Champaign. A shutout win week 1, then a top 20 win against a make-believe Bird week 2 in front of their first sellout crowd in 8 years. One more non-conference game left for Bret Bielema and company before they face Central Michigan this Saturday. He joined Rick Pizzo for today's big interview.
Bret, let's start with Saturday night. Probably dozens of aspects within that game that you were thrilled with. But for you, what was the best part of that night?
I think the appreciation for our fans, Illinois is no secret to anybody. Has had some stretches here that haven't been great, right? To have a full stadium, to have a ranked opponent, a non-conference game, those moments don't just happen very often. And then to come out and play the way we did and to win it and then let the crowd come down on the field, it was a pretty special night. And I think the wins always help, but it's the experience of the whole day, right? Now they go to their cars happy, they drive home happy. I'm sure they stopped in the tailgates maybe a little before and after, so everybody just got a better feeling of Illinois football overall.
Bret, we saw the AD Josh Whitman's post of the Northeast Towers, you and the fans celebrating with the ILL, INI. I mean, an unbelievable piece of video. How cool was that moment?
It actually happened a couple of years ago, just naturally. It wasn't rehearsed, thought, detailed. I literally came out of there, I can't remember what game it was, and I turned and I looked at Josh and I said, "You ever seen that before?" He's like, "No." And so he and I both kind of lived for that moment. It's a really cool, it's a very vertical shot that there's just a lot of people down. Awesome moment, and hopefully one we can continue to build off of.
I know, Bret, that game meant a lot to you, to the players. It certainly meant an awful lot to Aaron Henry. He was quoted as saying that after last year's loss, he rewatched that game tape 100 times or more. How good was he feeling on Saturday night?
I was right when the game got done. I literally was looking for him because I thought, they'd just done a great job. And really within the game, too, at halftime, made some adjustments. Finally got to him a little bit later on the field. And not just him, I've been very proud of our defense staff. Terrence Jamison, another former player of mine that Aaron and him both are coordinator, and co-coordinator, and then 3 new coaches that brought a lot to the table. Just really proud of our staff overall defensively. The very talented quarterback, a very talented offense, led the country in a lot of different categories a year ago. Forced him into three interceptions. Just a really good moment and one that we'll hopefully be able to build off of moving forward.
Jalen Daniels and that Kansas offense have flummoxed a lot of really good defenses. What specifically did your defense do so well on Saturday?
I think we tried to make it play a little left-handed. We do the time to throw ratio that he had used through early downs and third downs. Try to give him a couple different looks, let him throw into some coverages that he wasn't really expecting. And then I think up front, we had a plan to keep him in the pocket. We knew he was at his best when he was able to get outside and be creative. So really a couple different avenues working against him. And then, for us, everybody wants to know, I think we're one of the best in the country, and our turnover ratio 8-1. And I think our guys have just been opportunistic. And then for us, we talk all the time about CTO, TTY, which is catch the ones they throw you. Our guys have taken advantage of the opportunities when they come to them, and hopefully can continue to go forward into this week, our homecoming game.
Bret, I know it's easy for folks to say your best teams have always had really good running backs, because that's true. But when you go back and look, they also all have great turnover ratio margins and phenomenal special teams, which I think is sometimes a little bit overlooked. What's your take right now on where your special teams units are and where they need to be to get you where you want to be at the end of the year?
You know, Rick, it's interesting you say that. I had a lot of people reach out to me Saturday night, and many people like yourself in the media that I've built relationships with, they said that looked like a Bret Bielema team, right? And I took a lot of pride in that. And I think special teams is kind of a signature for people that look for a way to win the game within the game, right? And to be honest, we had a moment. I'm super proud of a lot of guys on our field, but we always talk about it's not what happens, it's how you react to what happens. And we have a young player, Mac Rasetich, who's a beginning player in our program who comes from a little small town, Illinois, and is playing on a big stage. And unfortunately, he had a bad moment that dropped a punt, but his reaction to that moment was, what do I have to do to make this successful? And he basically beat out about 4 or 5 KU players to come up with the ball and give us an opportunity to retain possession in a very difficult moment. So it was a great indicator of, hey, as bad as it was, it's about how you react that really matters. If he stood around and pouted or complained, we would never got that ball, and they probably would have got points out of it. So a really good teachable moment there on a special teams play that was everything. And had a young kicker, David Alano, a Chicago area young man that went 3 for 3, including a 50-yard field goal into the wind in a tense moment, and then really the game-winning clinch field goal that made it a 7-point, or basically a non-field goal. They needed to get a touchdown to win at the end, which put a whole different complexion to the end-of-game scenario as it played out.
You know, Bret, it made me think of, and I'm not sure what game it was that you guys won when you were at Wisconsin and you called a fake punt in a critical spot. It worked. I remember texting you to tell you what a great call I thought it was. And you said, yeah, it's always a great call if it works and when the players execute. But if you make the wrong decision, then I'm the idiot on the sidelines.
You know, it was a game against my alma mater, University of Iowa, at Iowa. The call was called change because if we ran the play perfectly, we were going to move the chains on a 4th down scenario, and if we didn't execute, the chains were going to work against us. Yeah, you know, we had a lot of guys have some individual moments. You know, James Kreutz, obviously everybody in the Chicagoland knows Olin Kreutz and his career in Chicago, but we have a starting center, Josh Kreutz, who's probably one of the most consistent players on our football team, and his little brother, James Kreutz, who doesn't like to be called little brother. He was our special teams MVP. I believe he had 10 coverage kicks, and he had 3 tackles out of those coverage units. Just a really good example of a guy that runs a reserve role for us off the bench as a linebacker on the verge of becoming a starter, but also a key special teams player on all 4 core units.
I, of course, should have known that you'd remember exactly what that game. You guys forget absolutely nothing. Hey, Bret, you said at the beginning of the year that this was going to be a different Luke Altmaier because of his comfort level, because of a second year in this offense, understanding what was being called and maybe even more importantly, why it was being called. How would you describe not just how he played on Saturday night, but how he's looked for you guys building up to this year and at the start of the season?
I give all the credit in the world to Luke and his preparation for this moment. He's been very intentional about relationships in our building with our offensive players, defensive players, with our coaches. I have several meetings where I'm one-on-one or I'm in a room with Luke, and I always say volume reflects confidence, and Luke's volume, not just in the meeting room, but on the field, has been exceptional this year. And then I would tell you, Rick, I think the biggest change, you know, for me is just the confidence in the players around Luke, right? Like, everybody understands some of those throws, some of those catches. They all, you know, give a lot of credit sometimes to other people, but Luke knows he's got confidence in the throw that those guys are going to catch him. He's got confidence in the pocket. And I think the greatest indicator of quarterbacks is when they can make something of nothing. And there was a key play, a 3rd and 9, I believe it was, in the 4th quarter. We were behind the chains a little bit, and Luke scrambled to his left, had a dump pass to Caden Fagan going to our left. And that little moment in time there, I don't think anybody had Caden Fagan on a game-winning 3rd and 9 conversion pass on their bingo card, right? And Luke just moved effortlessly. When you can have a quarterback move to your left as a righty and make a connection throw like that, that's saying something in a big way about what you can do when the things break down around you. So super excited about his growth, but even more about the future.
And obviously, quarterback that makes good decisions and good throws makes good wide receivers even better. I mean, obviously, we saw what guys like Tom Brady and Drew Brees did at the NFL level. Now, I'm not ready to compare Luke, obviously, to those guys quite yet. But when you look at your receiving core, they are guys who are somewhat unknown outside of Champaign. Pat Bryant had a great week 1. It was Zachary Franklin in week 2. How has this receiving core grown around Luke in the short start to the season?
You know, I give Luke a lot of credit. In the spring, he got intentionally with Pat Bryant and grew that room. We'd had 2 great players, Casey Washington, who's now with the Atlanta Falcons, Isaiah Williams, who's now with the Detroit Lions. They moved on to their NFL career, and that opened up the door for Pat. He's been very, very accomplished in what he's been able to do in these first 2 games, and it didn't happen by chance. He started working on it last January. He's a leader in that wide receiver room. Zachary Franklin, we brought in from the portal from Ole Miss, and I don't think his time was really enjoyable at Ole Miss, but he really enjoyed his time here and, caught 9 passes for us on Saturday, a couple just clinic tapes on how to do that. And then really some other guys within the room, Malik Elzy, another Chicagoland guy, a guy that has been very impressive through his fall camp to get where he is. Ashton Hollins made a huge play a week ago, and another guy sitting on the verge of doing something special. Had a freshman come in, Colin Dixon, who's really been a nice addition to us overall. So really have some guys emerge. I think we kind of like being the Bad News Bears. No one really cares about what our names are or how we do things. We just care about the results. And that wide receiver room, also a new addition to that room, Justin Stepp, a wide receiver coach we took out of South Carolina, who came in here, set his mark on changing that room, really brought some positive energy and vibe, and really has done a nice job of making that room take it to a different level this fall than they've ever done before.
Great scene on Saturday night in Champaign. Great start to the year for Bret Bielema and Illinois, off to a 2-0 beginning with Central Michigan on tap this coming weekend. Bret, always great to catch up. Keep it going, my friend.
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it very much. ILL.
The Rose Bowl has a lot of tradition. People that follow football. For me and the team, it's more of a business trip, whether we're playing in the Rose Bowl or in a parking lot. It's all the same.
Yeah, Curt Cignetti says it's the same, but it's still the Rose Bowl. And it's going to be a bunch of firsts. The first time UCLA is playing in a Big Ten conference game. First time Indiana's been out there since 1982, just out to the city of Los Angeles. Ross, this might be more of a challenge for Bruins fans than perhaps they thought it would be when they saw what their first Big Ten conference opponent would look like.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of firsts, like you said too. Two first time coaches, right? Coaching in their first game there. You saw last week. Curt Cignetti's group put up a lot of points, right? A record number of points, 77 against Western Illinois and 701 yards, which was also a record. Cignetti was pretty confident in the preseason, and that team returned a good amount. And you wondered if the new coach and the new staff could kind of get everybody going, get everybody playing together. And they look pretty solid. Certainly the last game, especially, it's got to be good mojo going into this week as the Big Ten gets cranked up, especially for Curtis Rourke, the transfer from Ohio, 15 of 17 last week for 268 in 2 scores. So we haven't seen a ton from UCLA, right? They played at Hawaii, struggled a little bit, but pulled the game out in the very end. And then they were on a bye week 2, but saw plenty of Indiana last week to scare you a little bit if you're a defender.
And Curt Cignetti and the Hoosiers, man, they are taking no prisoners right now. They are going out there, putting up every point that they can. And I respect that. First-year coach, sort of launching his regime in that way, wanting to make sure that folks are recognizing and respecting what Indiana's doing. UCLA now has had, though, that bye week that Ross mentions to try and prepare themselves. And I'm actually thoroughly impressed with the response they had in half number 2. You travel all the way over to the islands. You get the opportunity to play. First half didn't go well. They're looking sleepy out there. Came back in the second half, looked like a much better football team, more efficient and consistent on offense, a defense that began to stymie the Bows. So, they have themselves. They should be as prepared now for this game than they were by comparison to the first.
And we talk about the 77 points they put up. That Hoosier defense is playing really good. They've yet to give up 200 yards in either of the 2 games they've played this season. We mentioned at the top of the show the big matchup with Wisconsin taking on Alabama. Remember, Alabama does not have Nick Saban as their head coach. It's Kalen DeBoer. He was at Washington last year in the national title game. He's only been a head coach for 4 years, and now he's a head coach at Alabama. The thing is, when you're looking at this game, Ross, it's important to remember, even though some talent left and the head coach left from last year, there's still a lot of talent left on that Crimson Tide roster.
There is, and we've seen it. But we've seen two versions of Alabama. We've talked on this show today a lot about the difference between week 1 and week 2, and some teams had a little bit of a hangover from week 1, and Alabama was one of those. Blew out a pretty decent Western Kentucky team to start the year, and then played really poorly against South Florida. Needed a 28-point fourth quarter to kind of to go from a one possession game, which it was much of the game. And you wonder if Wisconsin defensively can exploit that Alabama offensive line, because that was the real bugaboo for the Crimson Tide was the offensive line. We saw them have, I think, 6 holding penalties. A couple were responsible for bringing back touchdowns. So can Wisconsin and the crew there, Darrell Peterson, those guys, can they get some real play against that O-line of Alabama? Because that's the thing that's the shakiest.
Yeah, tall task for Wisconsin. If you're curious, they haven't beaten a top 5 ranked team since they took down LSU in Lambeau in 2016. How about DeBoer's old team, Washington? Got a huge game for them. It's now a non-conference game, Washington taking on Washington State. Explain to us what the Apple Cup is and its history.
It is an old and rich rivalry up in the Pacific Northwest. You know, a couple of programs who, there can be at times a level of disdain that they have for each other, but I think on the whole, there tends to be a level of deference, of respect that's there. But for this season, because of all the newness that surrounds each of these ball clubs, there's going to be players who don't know as much about the rivalry, but they do know that Will Rogers leads Washington. He's been very efficient as a passer through their first couple of efforts this season. So as long as they continue to have some balance both with the pass and the run, this is a game I think the Huskies should control.
And a lot of history, 116th matchup. Last year it was real close. Came down to a Huskies field goal as time expired for Washington to get the win. One more here. The Boilermakers looked as good as anybody week 1, Ross. They were off week 2, and now they're taking on a at least mentally wounded Notre Dame team for their 86th meeting all time between these two programs.
Yeah, you wonder if it's good or bad to get Notre Dame off of that. Are they going to be really angry and coming out and showing the world that they should have beaten Northern Illinois, or are they going to continue to be a little sleepy? We have seen Hudson Card, QB for Purdue, really look good, right? That opener, but he's going to have his work cut out for him, right? The Notre Dame secondary in defense in general is one of the best in the country. That wasn't the problem last week against Northern Illinois. It was Notre Dame's offense, but can Hudson Card and the Purdue, his receivers, can they move the ball against Notre Dame? It's going to be tough.
Yeah, Hudson Card was amazing, but that defense for Purdue week 1 too was incredible. Gave up 154 total yards in that game. Today's big stat is the Buckeye offense. 108 points through the first couple of games. That's third most this millennium they've had to open up a season. And they're not playing this week. They will have their first of 2 off weeks this weekend. But Ross, what have we learned from them? They've had 2 dominant victories thus far this season.
Well, we've learned that Jeremiah Smith is really, really good. Right, and an incredible athlete, explosive player at receiver, true freshman for Ohio State. We talked about him a lot in the preseason. I think a lot of folks were expecting quite a bit out of him, and man, have we seen it through 2 games: 11 catches, 211 yards. And three touchdowns. And Will Howard is spreading the ball around to his playmakers. You know, he's surrounded by some of the best skilled players in college football, and he's doing that. And that includes Quinshon Judkins, of course, at running back, Travion Harrison. We saw them have quiet games week 1, but they exploded in week 2. So far, so good for Ohio State. It's the Ohio State I think a lot of us expected.
And that defense is so much fun to watch as well. There's electrifying talent on Ohio State's offense, but you see a degree of athleticism and aggression from that Buckeye defense. That's what we hoped we would see, because it's one thing to put a collection of talent together and you draw a bunch of fun stuff up on the grease board. It's different when you get between the white lines, when you got to go out there and execute at a high level. And through 2 games so far, the Buckeyes have definitely done that. You know, there's silver bullet type records that they could be in line for if the defense continues to execute at the level that they have so far this season for Jim Knowles. And so, yes, the highlights will largely be the Ohio State offense, but what could lead them to a championship, I believe, is more likely this defense that is really shutting folks down.
2 games in, 6 points allowed. Total. Not
First shutout they've had in a handful of years. I think 2019 was the last time they shut an opponent out.
Not bad. Not bad. And the interesting, the first half of their season, their toughest opponent would be Oregon. And I'm not saying it won't be a tough game, but you feel a little different about that right now than you did coming into the season for sure. Still might be a top 10 matchup when all is said and done. By the way, speaking of top 10 matchups, I know what you and Ross are doing tonight. You're watching the Big Ten Network. Top 10 matchup in volleyball. Nebraska and Creighton.
The epicenter.
In-state
of
rivalry.
volleyball.
We'll see you later on this evening.